welcome to another episode of Bite Size Buyers. This week you have myself, Sam Harris.
And I'm Rayvon West.
On this week's episode, we're going to cover three key topics. The first being Gartner's 12 disruptive technologies for future business systems. The ongoing news story in Spain and Portugal with the electricity blackout, and what does this mean for technology? And then we're going to round off with Intel Vision 2025, some key takeaways and discussion points. So without further ado, let's get into it.
All right, let's jump right in. So let's kick off this episode talking about Gartner identified 12 disruptive technologies for future business systems. They recently released this view and they identified 12 disruptive technologies, and we're going to unpack a few of them today. But before we do, let's take a pause. Disruption in technology has its pros and cons. So this should be interesting. I think just to kind of highlight some of the pros is disruption typically fosters greater innovation and competition. But on some of the drawbacks related to disruption are typically around like market instability as well as job displacements, right? So take those on board as we're going through these. But without further ado, Gartner basically listed their 12 disruptive technologies into 4 different segments. Those segments are application, infrastructure, data, and security. From an application standpoint, they really highlighted, and this is where we're going to place some emphasis today, is around AI composed applications. Within a data set, they looked at Earth intelligence, which is new to me, right? So that should be really interesting. And then from a security perspective, they talked about disinformation security. So according to a Gartner VP analyst, right, the directive is taking action on innovative advancements with like generative AI enabled code, architecture, disinformation security, and Earth Intelligent will provide the differentiation needed to help enterprises pull ahead of the pack, right, in terms of data and product offerings. So my perspective on that, if we look at the AI composed applications, I think that one's really interesting because with AI, I think it's fundamentally changing how we navigate and how we communicate with our primary business applications, right? So when we think about this, it's really a shift, like with AI and the language models, right? It's really shifting and enabling a system to really communicate with humans natively, right? And when we say natively, we're talking about through voice, text, and visually. And I think that's going to challenge software vendors to kind of refactor and replatform their enterprise applications, which should be interesting. And the Gartner view on this is that they predict that by 2029, more than 50% of user interactions linked to enterprise business processes will leverage large language models to bypass the UI layer in a traditional sense, right? Up from like 5% today, right? So pretty significant. Moving on to disinformation security, and I'm always a pro cybersecurity and making sure that you're proactive in that space. This technology is defined as it's an emerging discipline focused on threats from outside of a corporate control network, right? So last time we had an episode, we talked a lot about deep fakes. Well, disinformation security, right, encompasses that, right? So it includes a suite of technologies such as deep fake detection, impersonation prevention, and reputation protection as well too. So all key things. I'm not too sold on the Earth intelligence piece of it, to be honest with you. But the way that they're defining it is that they want to leverage AI to analyze satellite, aerial, and ground data to monitor Earth's asset and activities. So think about more accurate weather forecasting. I guess there could be a use case for that. I don't know how disruptive that will be, right, where I'm at today.
Yeah, of the areas you've covered, I have to admit, that's the one to me that feels a little bit more kind of
Yeah.
pie in the sky. You know, Yeah, okay. I can understand the applications they're talking about. You mentioned weather, the defense, for example, widely used satellites already. It just feels a little bit far fetched. I'm aligned with you on
Yes.
the thing that I'll be interested to get more insight from you on is just in that sort of middle section there. You talked about disinformation security, and as you mentioned, was we covered deepfakes on the previous episode. But I think disinformation security as a kind of a concept as a whole is something that we've not really touched on too much outside of some specifics around deepfakes.
Yeah.
So, from your perspective, from an overarching cybersecurity perspective, do you think this is the next key trend in the cyberspace? Is this the new frontier, or is it has it actually been a frontier for quite a long time? It's just coming more to the fore now.
I think so. And the reason why I say that is if we kind of just think more practically in terms of how we engage with anything, right? It could be our cell phones, it could be our our mobile, it could be our laptops, right? In a workplace setting, it could be our personal devices. If you think about how everything is related to smart devices, right? Where you even think about the Alexa, right? Where everything is voice controlled, right? Or your biometrics, where it's just a finger. You're not necessarily inputting an actual password or a code into things anymore. You're talking to it, right? You're touching it, you're feeling it. And when you have those certain types of things, like we talked about the last episode, right? It gives way to deep fakes and impersonations and things of that nature. And then when you layer on top of it what AI could do, that's why it's really an emerging trend from a cybersecurity perspective and something that should be on everybody's radar.
Yeah, interesting. Again, it goes back to that previous point, doesn't it? That AI is the problem and the cure at the same
And the
time.
solution.
Yeah. No, look, I think it's an interesting piece. There's a I always I always smile when I hear Gartner have got a list of 10, 12, 20. It's quite a fun game if anyone's not played it previously to wait a couple of years and then play bingo and see how many of them uh,
Really land,
come
stick
through.
around.
Yeah, exactly. There's been a couple recently that were slightly wide of
Oh
the
yeah.
mark, should we say? But look, I think you're right to call this one out. I think um, I noticed in there that they were using the phrase of, or the article that I was reading about this, using the phrase of AI replaces UI.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting way of looking at it. It's not something that it's not a way that I'd thought about it previously, but it's an interesting way of considering it.
Yeah, I actually thought that was pretty unique as well too. But I think when you really unpack that, I think it makes sense, right? And I think that's where AI, which we all know by now, that AI is one of those disruptors, like a key disruptor, especially for the more modern and new age. But it is a unique way to look at it. And it's going to take some grappling with, to be honest with you. So we'll see where that goes.
Okay, so second up today, and carrying on the theme of disruptions, we have the news, the ongoing news in Spain and Portugal, as well as parts of southern France and Andorra, of the power outage. And as yet, at the time of recording, so Tuesday afternoon, um, there's no clear understanding as yet as to exactly what's caused this. There is, I think it's worth pointing out that at the moment there are no claims of this being a cyber attack. Although I would say we can't rule anything out as yet because nothing has been confirmed. And what happened? So, in effect, power was lost almost in its entirety, and when we say power, I'm referring to electricity here. Um, Almost in its entirety across Portugal and Spain, and also southwest France as well. And you're talking about major cities here, the likes of Madrid, Barcelona, Lisbon, Porto, and really important locations and locations of growing importance in recent years in the technology world, both from services perspective, from a application maintenance and development perspective. Barcelona historically the home of the digital nomads, Portugal in recent times, a lot of investment into Lisbon and Porto and Braga from the IT services giants to develop high functioning delivery centers there. But also in the Iberian Peninsula, a big focus from the hyperscalers in terms of data center strategy. Abundant, there's an abundance there of clean green energy. So you're looking at solar, wind, tidal. We even saw last week, for example, last week, about 12 days ago now, Spain actually satisfied demand for a full 24 hours using solely green energy, which is
Wow.
quite something. They're averaging around 60 to 70%, I believe, at the moment, but really seeing advancements in that space. The worry here, though, is it's great to have access to that energy. It's great to have access to the land. So the way in which the hyperscalers have identified this location or these locations as being really strong candidates for the expansion of data centers and new data centers now will surely be being brought into question because they're looking at it and going, well, the infrastructure is just not there.
Mm.
If you look at all the expert reports from this, so far there's been one key theme, and that theme is it's a known problem that the infrastructure between Spain and Portugal is not good enough, and from a Portuguese perspective, solely reliant on Spain. So if Spain goes down, Portugal down with it.
Wow.
And that's got to be a concern. Now, look, I would also like to say just quickly here that there's been no reports of AWS, Azure, Google, or any other data center for that matter, as at the time of recording, of any disruption because of the diesel backups that they have in place as a secondary power supply. So, as far as we're aware, there was no impact from that side. It did mean though that the internet was down, so it was relatively hard to access anyway because there's no internet connectivity into the sites. But yeah, it'd be good to get your view on that power consumption piece, but also reliability and to your previous story, disruption.
It's interesting to hear that it's a known constraint between infrastructure and connectivity between Spain and Portugal because where I immediately think, as we're still on the topic of disruption, is okay, are those countries, is that region, how are they actually embracing AI, right? Because I think that's the piece that's the lost art around AI that not a lot of people pay attention to is that as these data centers, right, and operating these language models, they require a significant amount of energy and water, right? That can, as AI use kind of continues to proliferate, and so does the energy and water consumption needed to power that. And so when we think about going forward, there's the whole concepts of these AI powered data centers as well too, which I'm sure both Spain and Portugal will want to have their hands in the mix there as well too. How are they actually? Do they have the infrastructure to support that? And if not, where does that leave them as they look to try to
Yeah.
increase and be more progressive overall as well too?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think part of this does have to loop itself back around to decision making, I guess, for organizations in terms of going forward where they choose to, or the location of the data centers they choose to use, where they have a choice. Um,
True.
the it's great, as I said mentioned before about the sustainable angle in terms of the sustainability of the energy supply in the region, but we also need to be far better at storing that energy. Having the battery power to be able to produce, store, and then use when needed, which at the moment I think is slightly lacking as well, which doesn't really help.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a real surprise last night when the news was breaking and I was following it live as it happened, and a number of experts, including a member of the European Parliament from Portugal, who appeared on UK news last night, saying, "Oh, we've known about these issues. We knew the infrastructure wasn't good enough."
Wow.
And that feels like such a gamble to have taken. We've said before, but I'll stress again. Well, I said previously that it used to be the era of oil, right? And oil was the ultimate currency of the world. And then now we're in the era of the chips, really.
Yeah.
But the chips are useless without power and without data centers.
Fair point. Fair point.
So they go hand in hand here, and you when you mess with that ecosystem, if you want, of the data centers, of the cloud, of access to data, of the way the world now runs, naturally it's going to be felt, for a long time to come, and I suspect there's going to be significant calls now for a lot of investment in Spain and Portugal, but also this should serve as a wake up call for other locations as well. Yes, this has happened here. Who's to say it's not going to happen somewhere else? There's actually reports come out today that a few hours before the Portugal and Spain blackout, the Daily Telegraph, a large UK newspaper, are reporting that the UK experienced some interesting data in terms of the national grid in the UK a few hours prior to. Now, could be complete coincidence, could be linked. There could be some natural phenomenon, with weather and temperature and heat that's causing this, which is one of the loose theories. Although I'm not convinced. Now, it could have been the UK, and that could have been disastrous for the UK. It could have been the US. It could have been Spain and Portugal. It was Spain and Portugal as it happened on this occasion. But this should be a wake up call to the world.
All right. So let's wrap it up with our final topic of today's episode. Let's talk about Intel's Vision 2025 conference. But before we get into this, right, let's properly set the stage. It is no secret that the beloved chip maker has struggled, having once dominated the US chip market, right? But that is at best a long, distant memory for some, right? However, the recent change in leadership, bringing on a new CEO, and I hope I don't butcher his name, but Lip Bhutan, right? May do some good for the organization, right? And there may be brighter days ahead for them. At least that's the feedback that we're hearing coming out of Intel Vision's 2025 conference earlier this month. And we want to kind of hit you guys with a few key takeaways from that conference, and some key themes. So a couple of things to note. They talked a lot about AI as a pervasive force. Let me say that again because I just butchered that. AI as a pervasive force, right? And the talk track around this is that Intel truly does believe that it's AI everywhere, and that's their strategy going forward, right? The next key theme was chiplets as a game changer, right? So Intel's leadership in chiplet technology, they want to be a leader in chiplet technology, and in their position, they want to revolutionize, right, the chip design and making it far more flexible than what it has been in the past. But yes, they want to make sure that the chips are flexible, they offer customization and overall elevated performance, right? So they do believe the chiplets as a game changer. Moving on, manufacturing as a strategic advantage, right? And so a commitment to manufacturing leadership is essential for ensuring a secure supply chain, which is a good take on that. I like that piece of it. And from a procurement perspective, this one is pretty dear to me. Is they also another key theme coming out of there was partnerships as a necessity, right? So being able to leverage strategic alliances to serve the modern computing landscape, right? So for me, the biggest takeaways were AI everywhere, right? And the strategic partnerships. Those are the ones that really just hit home and resonated with me. We talk a lot about AI on this podcast, but it truly is everywhere these days. So how can we not discuss it to a certain extent? But more importantly, I think the piece that I want our listeners to really kind of take home with them is the concept that AI is not merely a feature but a fundamental transformation of computing impacting every aspect of technology, right? And then from a strategic partnership standpoint, I think the tech computing landscape has become increasingly complex over the years, right? Rightfully so. And collaboration across the industry is needed, right, to truly deliver complete package solutions for customers, right? And I think Intel and their new leadership really drove that message home. during their conference, and I think what Intel is embarking on a new bold journey to really define what the future of computing is. And I think we all should not take away from Intel's dominance of the past, because they know what good looks like in that state, right? And so I think this is something, or at least over the next 3 to 5 years, definitely something to be watched.
Yeah, 100%. And like, it's interesting. The one of the points that stood out to me in there was around the chiplets bit as well. And you can look back at some of the key moments in the journey of the chip over the years, and the integrated circuit, the microprocessor, which itself was
Yeah.
an Intel innovation, dynamic random access memory. You can go on and on and on, and then you come through, to the multi-core processors, etc. Now, and it feels like chiplets are that next stage and that next step, and I can see that being the case. It almost feels strange to see such an energy around Intel.
Yeah.
For the past few years, it's almost been the wounded animal in the space. Are they gonna be picked off by the vultures? And there were talks, even I think as little as 2 months ago, there were news stories that were convinced that what was going to happen was there was going to be a change of the guard, but rather ceremonial than anything else. And actually, they were going to be farmed off, and it was going to be TSMC and Broadcom were going to split, the foundry element and the chip design part of the business, and go their separate ways with it. And it feels like Intel now are coming out swinging, and they're here to stay. They're here for the fight, which is great. I think that the more competition we have in this space, always the better. Naturally, we lend ourselves to monopolistic and oligopolistic markets in tech. We saw with cloud. We're going to see with AI. I know we spoke about it before. We're going to see with AI in terms of the major chatbots. They're going to cannibalize and ultimately end up, as we have with cloud, with 3 or 4 big large providers, as we have with chips, 3 or 4 key players in the space. Um, sorry. But yeah, I think it's really interesting about a point on the strategic partnerships as well. Where
Oh yeah.
where do we see that going? I know that obviously the cloud service providers is the obvious angle. In terms of use of chips in data centers and all that kind of collaboration, all the rest of it. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear a bit more of your thoughts on where you see these strategic partnerships being that multiplier, if you want, being that game changer.
I think so. They actually called out, if I'm not mistaken, they called out some of their key. I think we're already seeing it. First off, right? We're already seeing it when you think about what Alphabet and what Google have done recently with Nvidia, right? Which we talked about that on an earlier episode on our podcast. And I think for what Intel had called out during their conference is that some of the software providers that they're looking to kind of build these strategic relationships with were obviously some common household names like Microsoft, Google, and VMware. But then even on a cloud services standpoint, right? They big, the big names, right? AWS, Azure, GCP, and even from a systems integration standpoint, I think they named Dell, HP, and Lenovo specifically. So very interesting in that aspect of it. But I think this feels like a fresh restart for Intel. Um, and it's encouraging and it's exciting to watch, because if we go back to where I think where their decline really started to happen, it was when they actually missed the mark, not landing the iPhone deal back in, I think, the early 2000s. Like, just imagine where they would be, right? Because you look at where Apple went when they launched the iPhone, and where that took them. So just imagine where Intel could have been along for that journey as well too. And something as simple as, and this is unaccounted for. I don't know if this is actually, but a lot of the reports that I've seen is that that deal fell through because they couldn't agree on price or intellectual property, right? So then you think about their
Yeah.
comments now around strategic alliances, right, and strategic partnerships. I'm willing to bet they probably took that one on the chin and said, "Hey, we vow to never let that happen again."
It's a lesson they always say about not repeating the mistakes of history. And then you look at what happened back in the day with like so IBM, with Microsoft. So the list goes on of companies who just missed out on potentially game changing deals at the time, or willing to turn them down. Yeah, no, look, I think part of this as well we have to accept is that the situation in the US, from a tariff perspective as well, and from an ideological perspective, will have given Intel an additional push that they might not have had under a different administration, which is to focus on US innovation and US manufacturing and US jobs. And for a company like Intel, that's a big boost. As a homegrown organization, obviously the issue that they can't resolve the chip manufacture in the US by themselves, but yeah, I think it's good to see them have another wind in their sails, and I'm interested to see where they go from here. So that concludes another episode of Bite Size Buyers. As always, guys, if you've made it this far, then thank you very much for listening. And we'll be back at the same time next week. And if you've got a news story that you'd like to hear us discuss next week, or if you've got any comments on today's stories, then please do leave a comment down below. If you've enjoyed the episode, please remember to support us by giving us a thumbs up and subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts. I've been Sam Harris.
And I'm Ray Von West.
Until next time.